Good morning, Shannon. Thank you so much for joining us. This is the fourth episode of the Safer, Cleaner Planet series. And I'd just like to make a brief introduction. This is Dr. Shannon Bragg-Sitton, who is the Director for the Integrated Energy and Storage Systems Division at the Idaho National Laboratory. Among many leadership roles she's held in her career, Shannon serves from 2014 to 2013 as a National Technical Director for the Integrated Energy Systems Program, and that is supported by the Department of Energy and the Office of Nuclear Energy. She also is currently the chair of the Generation 4 International Forum Task Force on Non-Electric Applications of Nuclear Heat, and she holds a PhD in nuclear engineering from the University of Michigan. Thank you so much for joining us, Shannon. First of all, I'd just like to ask you about the Idaho National Laboratory in terms of its history and the mandate that you were given initially, how that all came about under a president of the US, just so that our audience understands the significance of how you went about being set up in the first place.
Well, thank you, Laetitia, and thank you so much for the invitation and the opportunity to talk about all the great work that we are doing to advance our nuclear and other clean energy technologies to help support our energy needs in the future. Idaho National Laboratory does have a rich history. It has been operating under various names for over 70 years now. Idaho National Laboratory is one of 17 Department of Energy national laboratories in the United States, and we are the Office of Nuclear Energy Lead Laboratory. And that goes back to our roots as to why Idaho National Lab was established. We are located in a desert region in Idaho, fairly remote, and that gives us a lot of land and a lot of available resources just from that perspective of space necessary to develop, test, and demonstrate a wide variety of technologies. In fact, we have tested more than 50 different nuclear reactor technologies here at the site over that 70 years of operation, really working to develop some of those technologies very early in the development of nuclear energy for a variety of applications, whether those be for naval applications very early on in naval submarines or for our commercial power industry. And we have had the opportunity to develop and test a number of different reactor types that help us better understand their performance, and working with industry then to take those technologies and move them out into the marketplace.
And can you explain to me how that fits in the history of Atoms for Peace, which was set up back in the 60s?
So in the Atoms for Peace program, we were directed to use nuclear energy for good. We are an energy laboratory. We are not a weapons laboratory. We were focused, and always have been and will continue to be focused, on utilization of nuclear technology for the betterment of mankind, for clean energy, for abundant energy. And therefore, we were that location developing those technologies to ensure that our communities have clean, abundant power going forward. That legacy comes from our early years of operation and continues to operate. And we do utilize some of those very early facilities still and refurbish those and rehab them such that they can support the current development of advanced technologies.
On the point of the climate crisis, what would you say is the role of the Idaho National Laboratory in terms of how you're embracing the solutions for climate change?
So let's step back a little bit and understand what the challenge really is. What are we really trying to get to? If we look in the US, globally, many different countries, municipalities, and individual companies are establishing these really bold goals associated with deep decarbonization and net zero, meaning zero emission of carbon dioxide into our atmosphere. In the US, that equates to a goal for 2030 to have all of our electricity produced by carbon-free energy resources. And by 2050, to have net zero emissions, carbon-free, across all of electricity, industry, and transportation. So how big is that challenge, really? Well, right now, globally, electricity is still being provided. More than 64% of our electricity is still being provided by fossil fuels, and the remainder of that coming from low carbon energy sources. If we look at that 2050 goal and net zero emissions economy wide, we see that just over 84% of those energy demands are still being met by fossil fuels. Less than 16% coming from low carbon emitting sources, being wind, solar, hydro, nuclear, those types of energy sources. So we have a huge challenge in front of us. To achieve those goals, to meet that set of goals that have been put out, we need everything available to us in our toolbox to get to that end goal. When we have wind available, when we have solar available, those are fantastic resources and we want to use those, but those resources are variable. They require significant backup power to ensure that energy is available at all times it is needed under all weather conditions. And many look toward batteries to do that. But we have to dig a little bit deeper and understand what each of those technologies means for resources needed to produce those solar photovoltaic cells, to produce those batteries, how much land is really required to do that, and where are those materials coming from in the world to make these technologies a reality. But if we look at that holistic set of resources, include nuclear energy in that set of options, we start seeing very elegant solutions in many cases that use very small amounts of land. One of the questions that comes up is, well, what about the water utilization? We can also look at technologies that don't require any water, either for their primary cooling or for that power cycle. So these technologies are evolving. There's many opportunities available to develop the right types of systems that can utilize what is available for renewables, but also that best opportunity in the nuclear space to achieve these really incredible goals for deep decarbonization that we all need to achieve if we want to mitigate what we are seeing in climate change. This week, I happened to be in the US state of Arizona, where they have had a record number of days over 110 degrees Fahrenheit. It is quite warm. It is very extreme. And we need to keep our power sources operating to ensure that people receive the cooling that is necessary to survive these types of temperatures. Just west of Phoenix is the largest nuclear plant in the United States, the Palo Verde Generating Station, and they don't use any water from the systems that are potable water for the communities. Instead, they use reclaimed wastewater. These types of solutions are really novel, they are innovative, and they will get us to that end goal. What we do at Idaho National Laboratory helps to develop all of these new technologies to understand how we can deploy them in a variety of locations, but also how these technologies can work together in a very efficient manner such that we can take advantage of solar energy or wind energy when it is available, but ensure that we have a solid base of energy to support electricity demand, to support heat and steam demands in industry, and to support our transportation systems through the simultaneous and parallel utilization of these nuclear energy systems.
Thank you so much. That's very comprehensive. And in terms of the energy security side of things, how do you address energy security and the decarbonization goals? How do you get the balance right between the two? Because it obviously, making that transition is complex in America, and I just wondered what you thought was the main thrust of that initiative at the moment.
So when we think about energy security, I think there's multiple facets. Number one, energy security can mean security of supply. Is it reliable? Is it resilient? Is it going to operate on these extremely hot days or extremely cold days? So there's a reliability and resilience. And this means we need to ensure that that energy is available when it's needed, where it's needed, regardless of those weather conditions, which is why we need to have some of what is traditionally seen as a baseload generation system, but we can talk about how that might be a bit misleading with regard to how we can utilize these systems. that is dispatchable at all times. So meaning 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, that resource is available to us. And that ensures that we can get that energy to our citizens, our populations that need it at a wide variety of times. The second aspect of energy security is related to national security. Are we able to produce that energy regardless of what's happening in other countries? So that starts to look at where are those materials coming from to make those energy technologies, as I mentioned before, to build those solar cells, to build those turbines. Where is our fuel coming from for each of these technologies? We're seeing this play out significantly in Europe, where they are seeing challenges to their natural gas supply that is traditionally coming from Russia. If we tie our energy resources to fuel sources that are not available domestically or from partner countries that we have long-standing relationships with, that starts impacting our energy security. And we need to think about that as we develop these advanced systems and ensure that the materials required to build these technologies, the fuels required for these technologies, are available to us in the United States, in the UK, in Europe as a whole, within a set of countries or partners that we can continue to rely on.
So can you help the listeners understand where nuclear energy fits into this equation in terms of perhaps what has historically been the focus of nuclear as a solution, and how the Idaho National Laboratory is really taking that forward, and nuclear energy as sort of the baseload solution, if you like?
So nuclear energy has traditionally been used as a baseload supply. It is a thermal energy provider, meaning it produces heat, and that gives us a lot of inertia in our systems. We have a lot of inertia that we can then manage different fluctuations in the grid. But yes, traditionally, nuclear energy has been used to produce electricity at a very flat level to supply the baseload needs, and then we add to that with technologies that are highly flexible. We can add to that those renewable technologies to meet the variations in demand, whether those be just standard variations we have from day to day or between the weekdays and the weekends, or going across seasons. But we are seeing more and more fluctuation in what we call net demand. What that means is we have a demand coming from a particular location, from a balancing area for our grid. If we then start adding more and more variable sources such as wind and solar to that grid, the variations in those energy sources traditionally don't meet that demand variation. So now when we first apply that renewable to meet those demands, then we have what is called net demand. And we are seeing in some regions that net demand is now going down into that baseload, causing what are traditionally operated as baseload resources, just that flat level, to operate flexibly. Those may have to reduce power output at certain periods of time because there's excess energy on the grid, or at other periods of time we may see that we are lacking because we have so much of this variable supply being added at this point. But if we start thinking about nuclear energy as also a flexible resource, we begin to look at new solution options. Now, nuclear energy in many areas is not considered flexible. In fact, it is quite flexible. France has operated their nuclear fleet in a flexible manner for many years. And we do see that in some plants around the country in the United States as well, where those plants are being varied to match those demands. But ultimately, that may not be the best use of that resource. There's a lot of capital invested into these plants, into the fuel in these plants. And if we aren't utilizing that to its greatest extent, then those plants are not as economically viable as they could be. So what we started looking at about 10 years ago in the Idaho National Laboratory programs on integrated energy systems is, how do we do this better? How do we use those resources more efficiently, more effectively in a collective manner? So can we couple those baseload nuclear technologies with renewable technologies that are varying, and use those simultaneously to support that varying grid demand, but now also use that excess energy when it's available to support the production of other products. So by integrated energy systems, what we mean is multiple clean energy sources working collectively together to support multiple energy demands. So meeting that electricity demand, and when we have excess heat and electricity, producing alternative products such as hydrogen. And we can talk a little bit more about hydrogen because it is in the news and in the discussion space quite a bit now with regard to energy. We can also redirect that to thermal energy storage, store that energy when we have excess, and then deliver that when we have peak demands coming up because everybody got up for the day and energy demands went up, or in the evening when everyone goes home from work and the sun is setting and there's less solar energy available, we can pull that energy from storage. Now, let me just take a moment to explain why hydrogen is so important to this energy solution. And that is because it is essentially a form of chemical energy storage. We can take that excess energy when the grid doesn't need it and produce hydrogen without emissions using a few different pathways. At Idaho National Lab, we focus on what is referred to as high temperature electrolysis, meaning we simply take steam and break it down into hydrogen and oxygen. And now we have hydrogen that's been produced without any CO2 emissions. And we can take that hydrogen and deliver it as a feedstock to a number of chemical processes. It can be used in petroleum refining, in steel manufacturing. We can use it directly as a fuel source to produce electricity for the grid, or it can be used as a fuel source to produce electricity to operate a fuel cell electric vehicle. So now we're getting into decarbonization of the transportation sector. And there are so many more things we can talk about with that. And what Idaho National Laboratory is doing is we are turning these energy paradigms on their head. Instead of single source, such as a nuclear plant producing electricity for the grid, we are now turning that around to saying, what are all of my energy demands in a region? What are all of my energy resources? How do I work those together in a coordinated fashion to ensure that we use clean energy for all of those technology areas, that we deliver non-emitting energy to meet those demands? And we're demonstrating that both computationally, we're designing and optimizing what these systems might look like. But now we're to that point where we are building those. We are demonstrating how these operate collectively together to ensure that it is efficient, it is safe, and we can deploy these systems commercially in a municipality that desperately needs clean energy. So these are some of the areas we're diving into.
Yeah, yes. No, I just wanted to ask. So that's incredible that you're able to apply nuclear to so many different applications. Can I ask, so from your perspective, is it your understanding that nuclear is actually the optimal source of energy for these applications? Obviously, they can be complemented by renewables, but would you be able to say that nuclear probably is the most efficient choice of energy in that? Which one is it most specifically optimal for?
So let me rephrase it a little bit. I hesitate to say optimal because optimal depends on the region that it's operating within. It depends on the variation in demands. Some of these regions don't have the renewable energy source, and therefore nuclear might be the best clean energy source for that particular location. Other areas that have ample wind may not need a whole lot of that, or ample solar. So saying optimal starts driving us to single solutions that I don't think is the correct path to go down. What we need to look at is that optimal balance in a particular application region. And so what I'd like to say is broadly, I think nuclear energy is essential to meeting these global demands. And the fraction of those demands that are being met by nuclear or a renewable resource will vary depending on the availability of those other technologies and the efficiency of those other technologies in a particular region. We have to keep in mind that, as I mentioned previously, nuclear energy is fully dispatchable, available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and has extremely high capacity factors. meaning that it's operating all the time. Our fleet-wide average, and this is for nearly 100 reactors across the United States, our fleet-wide average capacity factor is 93%. No other energy resource comes close to that. We continue to make improvements, but renewable resources, they may vary in their capacity factors from as low as 20% to as high as 40%. Even the fossil fuel resources have significantly lower capacity factors than what we see in nuclear energy. So it is an absolute essential component to these solutions, but the optimal solution will vary based on a number of different external factors in a particular region.
So, and what about the innovation jobs that nuclear could potentially create? Could you talk to the other merits of nuclear, perhaps, that maybe people who've been cynical about nuclear may not be aware of?
Oh, so there's a lot. Nuclear energy does bring a lot of high-valued jobs to a region. These jobs are traditionally higher paying than their equivalents in other energy technology areas and other industries that might be in those particular regions. So one study that we have looked at here in the United States, and we see this being looked at globally, is what would be the impact to a community if I replaced coal-fired power plants with nuclear? If I pulled out that coal boiler and I put in a small modular nuclear reactor, what is the impact to that community? Number one, we're now removing an emitting source with a clean energy source. We're reducing pollution. We're improving air quality, improving quality of life as a result. But we can also then look at how does that impact those with jobs? Many of the jobs, I think it's on the order of 80%, that are in a coal-fired plant have an equivalent in the nuclear plant. And those job equivalents are actually higher paying in the nuclear industry. There are some specialty jobs in a nuclear plant, such as those that do the radiological safety and working with some of the very specific nuclear materials. Those are specialty jobs that we can train very specifically to utilize local resources, local staff to operate those plants, to run them very efficiently and effectively. So we now see opportunities in communities that may see an energy transition to clean energy in a very negative fashion because they see it as the potential collapse of their community, because those communities rely on those fossil resources. Many of them are getting those fossil resources, that coal, from their region. If you shut down those plants and you shut down the fossil industry, they're worried. They're very concerned about where they go from here. But if we replace that with nuclear, and of the 200 plants that were looked at in the United States, about 85% were found to be suitable at that first glance, that first study, to hosting a small modular reactor. And now we have that opportunity to, instead of kind of shut things down in a community, we are enhancing those communities, and we're engaging those communities from the start to talk about those potential opportunities, help them understand the technology options, help them understand those opportunities. And I might add that we can start looking at pathways to use that nuclear plant to take that fossil resource that might be available there, upgrade that coal into higher value products such as polymers and plastics that we use in our daily lives, using the heat and electricity that nuclear plant would then provide. So there's a lot of pathways for development and community growth versus some of the alternatives.
Yes. And to the point of safety, that's obviously something that, is one of your overarching concerns. It's both safety and waste are both key issues that are often raised by the environmental lobby. So to what extent at the INL are you addressing safety advances? Can you help bring people up to speed on where those safety advances have gone, and also on the fuel side, the advances that have happened? And in the context, also perhaps if you could, because you're the expert, explain a few different reactor types, because people usually just read in the newspapers about these small modular reactors, but in fact, it's a little bit more varied than that. There's a small modular reactor, there's the advanced modular reactor, there's the molten salt type of reactors, and the high temperature gas cool reactors. Those are the ones I sort of know mainly about. So could you just tell the audience, to break it down a little bit so they get a sense of that? And also, just additionally, across the US, to what extent can these be used off-grid and on-grid?
Okay, that was a lot of questions. So if I miss a few,
I'll remind you, don't worry. Yes.
Fill in. So let me start with safety. First and foremost, nuclear energy has the best safety record of any of these energy sources that we use. So that's something to understand. There have been very few nuclear incidents, nuclear accidents at nuclear plants, with a very limited impact to the health and welfare of the staff at those plants and the surrounding community. That is something that we have to understand. We need to dispel the myths and the fear around nuclear energy because it has operated safely. And the safety measures built into those plants have resulted in incidents occurring let me say that a different way. The safety measures built into those plants have helped us to operate them in a manner that those off-normal events do not result in any catastrophic result. Setting aside the Chernobyl reactor accident, which was a very, very different type of reactor design, a reactor design that we do not operate today. We do not build those plants in the West. So that is a very different type of incident. But if we look at other reactor plant accidents, those did not result in loss of life. The safety measures actually performed and mitigated any issues associated. So let's put that out there from the start. When we look at advanced nuclear technologies, we continue to learn, just like in any field, and add additional safety measures, additional performance measures. So let's look at the Fukushima accident. Out of that, we learned a lot about how to site a plant. There were some challenges, some issues as to how that plant was sited. We have also then looked at, well, how was that nuclear fuel designed? What really happened in that accident? Ultimately, it was an interaction with some of the materials in the cladding around the nuclear fuel. So globally, we took that as an opportunity to say, can we further enhance the safety of our fuel? And we entered into global development of accident-tolerant fuels, meaning that if that type of accident were to happen again and we saw extreme temperatures in the reactor core area, that fuel would last much, much longer. It would be able to withstand. It would operate for many more hours without the melting behavior that you see in some of these other technology areas. No, those are very, very low probability, very extreme events, but we learn every day how to further enhance that performance. And those accident-tolerant fuels are now in testing to demonstrate their performance so that they can be adopted in our existing nuclear fleet. So just because the outside of a plant doesn't change over the decades of its operation, know that there are many innovations going into that plant each and every year and being implemented as we understand them, as they have been demonstrated to provide those enhanced safety measures that we are looking for. Now, when we look at advanced nuclear technologies, we are taking those decades of learning and designing them to be even more robust. Many of these designs operate without active cooling, meaning they don't require a pump to keep that coolant moving, to keep the system cool. One reactor design that is a water-cooled reactor has demonstrated that it can operate for up to a week after loss of offsite power and keep cooling that reactor. And at that point, all of that temperature in the system will have gone down to a level where it's quite safe. And what's good to understand is that these advanced reactors utilize passive safety mechanisms. What that means is those safety mechanisms are based on the laws of physics. They don't require human interaction. They don't require a person like me to hit a button or turn a switch. They operate on those laws of physics, and try as we might, we can't change the laws of physics. So we continue to enhance that safety. Moving to the question of waste, you asked about
yeah, because that's usually what the environmentalists say. It's not the most optimal on nuclear waste. It creates radiation risks. So that's I know that in Sweden, for example, they have a great record in dealing with their nuclear waste. So how at INL have you tackled that issue?
So let me again offer a rephrasing.
Yes.
Rather than calling it nuclear waste, think about it as used fuel. It's been used once in a reactor.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point in time, so we have solid fuel elements that have uranium in those fuel elements. When we pull those out of the core, they still have about 90% of the potential energy still available in that fuel. To get to that next 90% of energy, we could reprocess that fuel, pull out the things that are preventing it from operating the way that we really need to, get some of those fission products out. The results of that fission are what we call fission products, smaller atoms, and we need to pull some of those out and reprocess that fuel to put it in a fuel form that we can then operate again in an advanced reactor. And many of these advanced reactor designs do look at completing that fuel cycle by using once burned fuel from a light water reactor and then operating it in these advanced reactors. We know how to reprocess. We've done this in the past. And in fact, there are countries that currently reprocess, such as France and Japan, because of limited domestic resources for the uranium fuel materials. So we can do this more broadly. We can reprocess that fuel, use it even more effectively. Think about it as recycling. We all use recycled paper, recycled plastic. Let's start looking at recycled fuel. We have done a lot of research in fuel recycling at Idaho National Lab to ensure that those processes are safe. They implement safeguards, meaning we keep control of all of those nuclear materials. We can track it, and we can't have a bad actor come in and insert themselves into that process and get a hold of any of those materials. Let's look at what we do now. Right now, in the United States and in many countries, when we've operated that fuel in the reactor, we pull that out. We refuel our reactors, our light water reactors, every 18 to 24 months. And at that period, we pull out about a third of the fuel and we put it into first a cooling containment system, water cooling typically, right there by the reactor. And then after it's sat there and cooled down some, we pull it out and put it in dry cask storage. If we look across the commercial nuclear sector, in the United States, we've been operating commercial nuclear since the 1950s. We know where every bit of that fuel is that has operated in those plants. We can find it, we can track it, and it's frankly not that much. If we took all of that used fuel material and stacked it onto a football field, an American football field, it would be less than 10 yards high. So less than 3 meters. It's very small, it's solid, and we know where it is. So that's very important to know. So I think many people have misconceptions about the volume that we're really talking about. And they have misconceptions about the form of that fuel, that used fuel that's coming out of these plants. But in fact, it's quite manageable, and we do know how to manage that. We can also look to long-term geologic repositories, and many countries do that. The Finland solution is a long-term repository. I'm going to mispronounce it. It's Olkiluoto is the repository. We are looking to those solutions in the United States as well. So I like to put that out there, that there are many options to continue to use that fuel. There are many options to store that fuel, and we know where it is.
Can I just interrupt for a second and just ask? So you mentioned light water reactors. So there's advanced modular reactors. My understanding is that there are different types. So in terms of the ones that you've been incubating at INL, could you just explain the slight difference? Because obviously a high temperature gas core reactor is very different from a light water reactor. Just the main ones.
Certainly. So the current reactors that operate around the world typically use water as their coolant. In the US, we use light water, meaning just H2O, to cool that reactor. And most of our plants are on the order of 1 gigawatt of electricity generation each. So that's 1,000 megawatts of electricity coming from a single reactor unit. There are other solutions. In Canada, they use heavy water, which is deuterium oxide to cool their plants, and that then changes the types of fuels that you would use for that facility. What's coming down the line, these advanced reactors that are being developed start looking at how do we design these systems to be smaller? How do we design them to operate at higher temperatures? And how can we look to the different cooling materials to help us do that? So we hear a lot about small modular reactors. What that means is most plants, they have, like I said, one large reactor. We start looking to economies of scale. Build it bigger, it gets cheaper. A small modular reactor has a standard international definition that each module, each reactor unit, would be up to 300 megawatts electric each. Many of these plants would then have multiple modules deployed in a single unit. So you have some common technologies, some common components that can be shared across those that can help reduce some costs. These can be very small overall. So those modules, I said, up to 300 megawatts electric, they might also be down on the lower end. Each of those modules might be 50 or 100 megawatts electric. And smaller communities, smaller applications can now start looking at how those units might fit their demands very effectively. So a particular location might only need 2 modules, or perhaps they need 4 modules, and their demand grows. We can add modules as necessary to meet those growing demands. We also have a lot of development in very small systems called microreactors. Those have a little bit less of a firm definition around the power level, but they're typically around 1 to a few megawatts of electricity production. But where we start really getting benefits with these small systems is how we can fabricate them and how we can move them to the sites. So small modular reactors, these are factory built. These can be moved to the site for assembly using standard modes of transportation, rail, trucks, things like that. So we can begin looking at economies of quantity. So building more and more units in a very standard fashion at a single type of factory or facility. And we can start locating those facilities around the country and around the world rather than single locations that are currently being depended on for the very large vessels necessary for the large scale reactors. Microreactors take that step even further to where they are small enough that they can be truly considered as mobile systems. So we can not only make all of those components in a factory, but now we can even assemble them, ship them to site as a nearly complete unit, put them within their containment structures or their safety structures, such as locating those underground, in many cases, right on site at those facilities. So small systems now have those opportunities to start supporting remote applications like mining,
yes,
remote communities and facilities. And we can also start looking at using those types of very small microreactors for disaster response. When we lose the capability to generate energy due to a hurricane or some other natural disaster, these units are now mobile in such a way that we can get those out to the site, provide electricity, provide energy to support those disaster responses.
Would that
now,
include,
you also asked...
Would that include desalination, for example? Could that include?
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So we are looking at desalination as one of those options. So one example I like to give is when Puerto Rico was dealing with Hurricane Maria and lost grid electricity for quite some time. They also lost potable water because that was being driven by a lot of those systems. But if we now think about a unit that we can deploy in basically a tractor trailer in a contained system, get that operating maybe offshore very rapidly, and we are developing other components that we refer to as a microgrid in a box.
Yes.
So we have a hardware component that can be delivered right there with it. And now think about another module that has desalination systems.
Yeah, because
so now we can
water scarcity is something I think that scares quite a lot of people going into the future. So that would be an incredible breakthrough.
Absolutely. And we do have nuclear plants around the world today that desalinate water for local use. And we want to do that on a larger scale, specifically looking at those water regions that are in severe water scarcity and see that getting worse, or in these regions where we're looking at that disaster response and they need those essential services, meaning electricity, water, heat, depending on where that's located in the time of year. Now, you also asked about the types of reactors. So as I mentioned, most of the reactors operating around the world today use water as a coolant. Those operate at about 300 degrees Celsius as their maximum output temperature, which is great. It's very useful for many applications. But when we start looking at energy systems and power conversion, we get more and more efficiency as we go to higher temperatures. So many of these advanced reactor technologies are now looking to other cooling materials that offer us the opportunity to go to higher temperature. In your question, you mentioned high temperature gas cooled reactors. These are on that far end of the highest temperatures that we can really get to. They typically use helium as a coolant, helium gas. And those can operate, depending on how it's designed and how far we'd like to really push up the scale, anywhere from 700 to about 900 or 950 degrees Celsius. The systems that are in development today focus more on that 700 degrees Celsius range because of the materials. These are materials we understand at those temperatures, and we have a lot of data to understand how those will perform over many years of operation. And then we will build that base, work toward those higher temperatures. And that's where national laboratories such as INL and other similar labs around the world really help to develop that data set to understand those materials and their performance under those very high temperatures. Now we can step down to look at other systems that operate at high temperatures, and let's talk about liquid metal cooled systems now. Liquid metal cooled systems are exactly what that says. They use what is traditionally a metal at room temperature, but at high temperature, those flow. That is a liquid that can be pumped around that system. Some of the coolants that are being looked at are sodium. We also look at lead or lead bismuth around the world. In the United States, we are looking a lot at sodium. Some companies are looking at a lead coolant here in the US, and those help us to operate at that around 550 degrees Celsius range. We also talk about molten salts. That always seems really strange to some people. We're not talking about the salt that you have on your dinner table. There are many different types of salts that similarly can be operated at high temperature. Those can be melted and used as that cooling material to pull the heat from that reactor core. Again, the temperatures of operation are going to depend specifically on the salt that you select, but we're again in that 500 to 600, maybe even 700 degrees Celsius range. So we get to those higher efficiency power conversion cycles by looking at those higher temperatures. Now, when we talk about molten salt systems, there's a couple of types of systems that your general audience may not really care about, but they're very significant to how you design them. In one case, think about it as replacing the water with that liquid salt. We're just pumping that around as a coolant. There are other systems that actually use molten salt with fuel dissolved in the salt. What that does is it can even further increase the efficiency, but it changes how we handle the operation of that system now that we're moving uranium fuel around with that coolant. So we just have to change how we look to that. And you'll see technologies being developed across all of those technology areas. And at INL, we are working with many of the companies that are developing technologies across all of this space, helping them to understand their chemistries, to understand their operational performance, to understand performance over time. And we do that both using our models and the computer systems to understand how do we design better systems, but then also demonstrating that in laboratories, first without nuclear fission happening, using electric heating to understand some of those performance areas, and then moving to where we have nuclear energy input as well, and actually fissioning systems. And we're working toward demonstrating many of these technologies here at INL, but also at our sister laboratories around the country.
So that brings me neatly to my next question, which is talking about the specific partnerships with companies that perhaps people have already heard of, the ones that you have announced. Could you just take us through a few of the examples? TerraPower being one of them, Rolls-Royce as well, and Westinghouse, the companies that at the moment are progressing nicely through this advancement process.
Absolutely. So first, let's talk a little bit about how many of those companies there really are. If I look globally, the number I've just recently seen is that there are more than 70 advanced reactors being developed across many different companies, many different countries. That's a lot. There are so many things in development. Some of those are at very early stages of development. They are computer designs. They're trying to enhance how those might operate, enhance on some of these technology areas that I've just gone through. Well, where others are much closer to that demonstration point. Within the United States, we as a nation have invested in accelerating development of some of these systems. So in 2020, the Department of Energy began investing in what we call the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program, ARDP. What this does is it injects public funding into the development of these technologies in a cost-shared program. So under the ARDP, the first installation, I believe, was $160 million US injected into developing two primary technologies. One of those is the X-Energy XE100 system, and that is a high-temperature gas-cooled reactor system. The second is the TerraPower Natrium reactor, which is a liquid sodium-cooled reactor. So those are moving forward in demonstration. Those plants will be demonstrated. X-Energy has recently announced that they plan to demonstrate that technology in partnership with Dow Chemical at a plant on the coast of Texas, which is really exciting because that means not only will they demonstrate their reactor technology, but they will also demonstrate this utilization of that very high quality heat and steam available from their XE100 to support chemical processing at a facility, leveraging the fact that these are very small systems and can be dropped into these existing industrial applications. The second one, the Natrium reactor, will be sited at a retiring coal plant in the state of Wyoming, not too far from where we are in Idaho. And again, that one is very exciting in that they will start proving out, number one, how that unit can go into a coal community and continue to provide them power, but now that is very clean, removing the pollution that is currently being emitted by the coal-fired unit, and using some of that existing grid interconnection infrastructure in that community. And the community is very excited about it. They're very supportive of this demonstration. They also are going to be able to demonstrate then how you can use thermal energy storage. So coupling that nuclear plant with a storage system to improve the efficiency, improve the operation, improve the flexibility of that overall plant. INL has been involved in both of those projects, helping them to evaluate the system designs, to develop the fuels and demonstrate those nuclear fuels that will be utilized in those designs, really building upon decades of expertise that are housed within the national laboratories, using very unique facilities at the national laboratories to support the development of their systems. We have other examples such as Oklo, which is a microreactor that is also in development. This one's discussed in the Nuclear Now film, where you met with the leaders of that technology area. They also plan to utilize the vast amount of land that we have at Idaho National Laboratory to demonstrate their technology. Now, they have gone a slightly different path. They are not a part of that ARDP program because they chose to remain privately funded to support their technology development. But because of the unique aspects of the nuclear fuel necessary for these advanced reactors, they are working with the Department of Energy to ensure that they have fuel supply for their system and then to demonstrate their technology on that Department of Energy facility in eastern Idaho. There's many other examples where we are working with these companies to help them assess their designs, to demonstrate the individual components, to further develop the technology readiness of these systems. So we are really excited to be involved in many of those. Another that I'll mention is, so we talked early on about the rich history of Idaho National Laboratory. Idaho National Laboratory supported the first production of electricity from nuclear energy. The city of Arco, Idaho, I can't even really say city, it's a town, it's small, was the first city to be powered by nuclear energy. That was done with the experimental breeder reactor 1, which is now a museum. You can come out and see that facility yourself and how that operated. And then we had a second facility called experimental breeder reactor 2 that operated, helped us better understand some of these systems. That has since been decommissioned, so it's been shut down, the internals removed, but now we're using that infrastructure to support development and demonstration of more microreactors going forward. So we have readied that dome facility where we had EBR2 to support many different microreactor tests. So meaning we can prep that over a 3 to 6 month period to bring in a microreactor technology from one of these many companies developing that, and demonstrate how that system operates for maybe 6 months or so, and then allow them to shut that down and move it out and be readied for the next microreactor to come in. So we are preparing that facility to support many different companies. We're expecting one of those first systems to come in the next couple of years. I think they're still vying for who's going to be first in there. We've got a list of companies wanting to demonstrate their technologies in Dome so that they can show the safe performance, they can show the overall efficiency, and then move to a full-scale commercial system.
That's wonderful. It's so comprehensive and extremely inspiring. My last question, just before I wrap up, is just to ask about how you work with other institutes in terms of the general global effort to advance nuclear technology around the world, around harmonization, standardization. And sort of I'm going to wrap up there in terms of also how you're helping to promote nuclear technologies to the younger generation. So
certainly. So climate change is a global problem. It is a global challenge, and therefore we need to have global partners. So we are working with many different organizations and countries around the world to accelerate development of these technologies. Some of those are multilateral, such as via the International Atomic Energy Agency, which runs technical meetings and coordinated research projects looking to leverage expertise around the world to support development of these systems. We also have a global national laboratories consortium that focuses on these integrated nuclear renewable energy systems. And that is a partnership across the leading nuclear countries that are developing these technologies, but we're bringing our renewable labs along with us to ensure development. That is actually started up and based out of the UK's National Nuclear Laboratory, and we have 5 countries now engaged in that activity, really looking at how do we work with our modeling tools and share those modeling tools to help one another better understand the system opportunities. How do we leverage the experimental facilities that are around the world so that we don't duplicate facilities that are very costly to design and build and operate, but instead share facilities where appropriate to further these technologies. So we have many different bilateral arrangements where the U.S. is working, and specifically the Department of Energy is working with their equivalents in the UK, in France, in Canada, Japan, Korea, all of these things coming together to get to that solution. And then you asked about communication. How are we reaching out? We are doing a lot of grassroots efforts through the laboratory and through our programs within the Department of Energy to engage in communities, to talk to them about energy options, not presuming solutions, but talking to them about the options they may have available, which include nuclear energy, but not directing what needs to be done in a community, but talking about those options. So those communities are very, very much a part of those decisions. So that's very important. We also do a lot of work to reach out to the younger folks that are going to be part of our workforce of the future, but also our innovations of the future. That means going into the university level, the secondary school level, those high schools, but even earlier, getting into talking to those middle school science classes. So this means around 12, 13 years old, when these children are just starting to understand the potential opportunities in science and technology, helping them to understand energy options and build those opportunities for future careers.
Wonderful. That is so fantastic. And thank you so much for such an insightful and inspiring interview. I think that anybody who's listening to this is going to be at almost degree level now in terms of their understanding of the issues. So I cannot thank you enough, Shannon, for giving us your precious time to share such detailed insights into the industry. And I hope that perhaps we can come back to you in a year or two and get an update on everything you're doing at INL, so that we can share more stories about what's happening here in the UK as well, because we're going into really a nuclear revolution in terms of tackling climate change and energy security. So it's a very, very exciting era, and you've been an incredible pioneer in that. So we are incredibly grateful for your time. So thank you so much, and hopefully we'll see you again soon. Take care.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Goodbye. Thank you very much.